Very much. We need to get inside into Haynes Hall. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Haynes Hall is right over here, and it's named for Charles Haynes, who was a professor here in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. We're going to take you in there for the next panel, and it's on the Middle East.
Be a more timely and important set of issues. Seeing the full House here suggests just how seriously people and readers and citizens are taking these matters. And we'll have a chance to explore the entire question of where the Middle East is and where it's going from a variety of crucial perspectives. One indication, I have to say at the outset, of how vital and authoritative and distinguished our panel is that we lost one panel member because he was actually snagged by the Pentagon to help solve the problems in Iraq already. As you may have seen on your program, there was an author and law professor named Noah Feldman whose new book, After Jihad, looks like a terrific book, talking about the potential for Islamic democracy. And he apparently was asked by the Pentagon to immediately go to Iraq to help write the new Iraqi constitution. So it is always possible, showing, by the way, that the Pentagon, I guess, disproving with that one tiny tidbit that not only Bechtel and Halliburton are actually getting the early contracts for post-war Iraq, but even law professors who do things like write constitutions. So it's always possible that cell phones will ring, and during the panel we'll lose some of our distinguished guests who will be called to immediately solve breaking on-the-ground problems. But what we have, nonetheless, even though we are one man down, are absolutely terrific and authoritative folks who can offer really the two indispensable perspectives on this region, which is the power of religion and the power of history, and how those two colossal, complicated and fascinating forces come to bear on the present, the past, and the future of a region that's of high interest to all of us. Just a word about the format. In a moment, I will introduce our panelists. They will each offer remarks of perhaps 12 minutes, 13, 15 minutes, some discussion that you'll hear based on their perspective on where we'll go from here in the Middle East. I will then tease out a conversation based on the fascinating remarks and insights that I know that they will share, and we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A with this interested audience. When that time comes, I will ask folks to come to the microphones on either side and identify themselves for the discussion so that we can make sure that we're engaging with this group on the issues that matter most to you. Now to our panel. On your left is Professor Akbar Ahmed, who is chair of Islamic Studies at American University in Washington, D.C. He is perhaps the world's most distinguished authority on Islam. His new book, the latest in a number of books that is due in June, is called Islam Under Siege. It's already being hailed by the president of the American Council for the Study of Islamic Societies as the most important book to date on life in the post-9/11 world, and basically essential to understanding all the issues involved in the discussion of a potential clash of civilizations and the need for deeper empathy on all sides of these religious questions. But Professor Ahmed has done much more than this. He's been involved in government. He's been the ambassador to the United Kingdom from Pakistan. He has, through his previous books, which have been, one of them was the basis of a long BBC six-part documentary on Islam, Understanding Islam. But to give you some sense of Professor Ahmed's crossover appeal, he's also been on Oprah several times discussing Islam. And so, depending on whether we want to go highbrow or middlebrow or lowbrow, Professor Ahmed is clearly our man. Joining him on the panel is Michael Oren. Michael Oren is a senior fellow at the Shalem Center, a Jerusalem-based research facility, and the contributing editor of its journal Azure. He is, as of last night, the newest prize winner for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in History for his terrific book, 6 Days of War, June 1967, and the Making of the Modern Middle East, published by Oxford University Press. Michael Oren was raised in New Jersey, but moved to Israel in the 1970s. He served as an officer in the Israeli Defense Forces. He was later an advisor to Israel's delegation to the UN and director of interreligious affairs in the government of Yitzhak Rabin. He is not just a historian, by the way, and maybe we'll have a reason to get into some of his other activities, because his new novel, Reunion, will be published this year about a gathering of World War II veterans in a small Belgian town. And Michael Oren lives in Jerusalem with his wife and 3 children. Welcome to the panel, and let me start with Professor Ahmed to begin our conversation.
Thank you, Matthew, for that very warm introduction. It's a great honor to be here at the LA Times Book Festival, a great honor to address this distinguished audience. And I'm delighted that my very good friend, the distinguished Professor Stanley Wolpert, is here. He's a great name, great ambassador in understanding between Islam and the West. You're very much needed these days, Professor Wolpert. That is the theme of what I want to say, my few remarks, that the need for understanding between the United States of America, representing Western civilization, and the world of Islam is really at its height. The gaps are growing, and the need for understanding appropriately is increasing. Take our panel, the Cauldron, Turmoil, Middle East, all these concepts are associated. And yet, implicit is the assumption that we are talking of the Middle East and equating it to Islam. And yet Islam is a global civilization. There's also a crisis in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Kashmir. There are vast areas. Former President Clinton called South Asia the most dangerous place on earth. So we really are looking at global civilizations. And the United States of America at this moment in time is physically in the heart of the Muslim world. Young American soldiers have to very quickly learn about sect, tribe, ethnicity, and learn that history for that part of the world is very much alive. History that began in the 7th century, 8th century. So 2 different societies very quickly beginning to grapple with these issues. What I have tried to do in the book that Matthew introduced, Islam Under Siege, Living Dangerously in a Post-Honor World, is to try to look at what is happening within Islam, to try to work out how society is changing, how leadership is changing, how ideas are changing within Islam, and how that is having an impact outside Islam. And one consequence of that we saw on September 11, the tragic loss of lives when 19 young men, hijackers, flew into these buildings and killed totally innocent people. Now, they've raised all kinds of questions, and we've heard these questions. Does Islam preach violence? Does the Quran preach violence? Is Islam compatible with democracy? This question is going to come up more and more with Iraq, with the Shia population demanding their rights, and you're seeing this on television. Does Islam subjugate women? So all these urgent questions come flying out at us from the television, from the media, from the scholars. And I have tried in this book to grapple with this, again, as I say, by looking at society within and then trying to relate it to the global context. So what is happening in society? Why is it happening? And what we need to be doing to move forward. I'm arguing that this is a time when traditional societies are undergoing dramatic changes. The processes of globalization are creating a sense of disequilibrium, of rapid change, of uncertainty in most traditional societies. This is not restricted to Islamic societies. And this dramatic change, the pace of change, is creating a great deal of uncertainty, fear, even paranoia in societies. And that is why understanding of the core issues becomes absolutely crucial. Otherwise, it becomes very easy to go to these young men, sometimes they don't know much about Islam itself, and to convince them that the best way forward is violence and is anger. And those are very dangerous responses to complicated world situations. So we've heard of concepts such as postmodernism. I'm using the concept of post-honor. I'm using this because I'm an anthropologist, and anthropologists look at culture and society, at small-scale societies, traditional societies. And when you talk to ordinary people in the villages of Africa and Asia, you will suddenly realize how the sense of being under siege, how much they're feeling that. You hear this all the time. And this is a great paradox, because here in the United States, if you remember, after September, the news was broadcast on television as America under siege. And yet what I'm finding is that most traditional societies are also feeling a sense of being under siege. So you get under siege over here and under siege over there, and you have the basis of misunderstanding. So once again, the need for understanding. So what is the way forward? I'll try to be brief because Matthew had said we have a limitation. We can then explore this in the question-answer session. The way forward, I believe, is number one, to really begin the process of understanding each other. Over here in the United States, understanding Islam. Now, on September 10, very few people knew very much about Islam. And I want to point out that some of the greatest authorities on Islam are in the United States. I just mentioned Professor Stanley Wolpert, and there are some other figures of this stature. But generally, there was little understanding. So since then, there has been a great surge in Islamic studies, Islamic books, commentary on Islam, and so on. This process needs to take place in the Muslim world also, where there's an equally limited understanding of the West, particularly of the United States of America. So that is the first process. This process of understanding needs to begin, led by the community leaders, by the intellectuals, by the statesmen, stateswomen. Secondly, when we talk of the Muslim world, Matthew mentioned the constitutions. We are constantly making the mistake of imposing foreign frames, ideological and conceptual frames onto other societies. The most important aspect in Muslim society today, the most challenging aspect, is education. Because unless education is changed, the thinking of the young men who are prone to violence, who are easily led to violence, will not change. The Taliban may have been removed in Kabul, but has the system that produced the Taliban, the educational system, has that been changed? I would like you to ask this question of yourselves. And the answer obviously is going to be very uncomfortable, because I don't think very much has happened. The syllabi needs to be changed. The teachers, the training program for the teachers needs to be revised. These teachers who are teaching the young men, we need to be finding out what they are teaching these young men. Because if that doesn't happen, I want to remind you that we are talking of a civilization that is 1.3 billion, that is growing, that is 56, 57 states, one nuclear at the moment, and very committed and very passionate about their own culture and their own religion. So this process of education becomes absolutely crucial. It's not an academic or a theoretical suggestion, a very practical suggestion. Then the notion and practice of democracy. We cannot be ambiguous about this. Democracy has to take plant in the Muslim world. Muslims will constantly move away from this. They are ambiguous about democracy. They will say we have corrupt rulers, or they will say our military dictator is such a wonderful, benign military dictator. There should be no compromise on this. Democracy has to come to the Muslim world. Let the process begin. It will fail once, it will fail twice, it will fail 3 times, but eventually it must come. And I want to point out that we may think that democracy is purely a Western invention and that the Muslim world does not have democracy, particularly in the Middle East. Professor Wolpert has written a classic book on a certain gentleman called Mr. Jinnah. Jinnah led the Pakistan movement in the 1930s, and he was a Democrat. He symbolized democracy. Women's rights, human rights, minority rights, all this were embodied by Mr. Jinnah. So the Muslim world is familiar with democracy. No more excuses. It has to come. Finally, how do we move ahead? What are the points of contact? Are Muslims all there, out there, as the media portray them, terrorists, fanatics, and so on? Or are they essentially a civilization which has possibilities of dialogue and mutual understanding? I believe the latter, because we need to understand that Islam is part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. It is an Abrahamic faith. And for anyone who has any doubt about this, 3 days ago, I was invited by my dear friend, Senior Rabbi Bruce Lustig, who heads the Washington Hebrew congregation, for the Seder. And in the synagogue, he acknowledged this in public. And the initiative he has taken with Bishop John Chain of the National Cathedral and myself, we are emphasizing the Abrahamic tradition of dialogue and mutual understanding. Today, Abraham becomes a powerful symbol for all three faiths. All three faiths revere him and respect him. If you talk to a Muslim, he will have the highest respect for Abraham. And then you remind the Muslim that if Osama bin Laden is telling you to throw bombs at the Jews and the Christians, they are also people who have a similar respect and affection for Abraham. And you suddenly have a common link. If you only talk in terms of politics and exchanging land and peace and territory, then you are removing what I believe is the most powerful common theme and link between these three faiths, and that is the Abrahamic vision. My own grandson is called Ibrahim. The book that's being advertised here, Islam Today, is dedicated to Ibrahim, my grandson, and he is named after Abraham, the great prophet. A lot of you will not know this, but every time a Muslim prays, he blesses Abraham, and he blesses every time. Right now, as I'm speaking, there must be millions of Muslims saying prayers right now, and they bless Abraham and the family of Abraham, the descendants of Abraham. So next time a Muslim says, we're going to blow up Jews and Christians, remind them that they want to blow up the family of Abraham, for whom you're praying 5 times a day. Now, these are some things that we need to be aware of each other, and they will create a sense of common unity and a common civilization and common humanity. And I think that is something we need to be moving to for the 21st century. Otherwise, as my subtitle says, it is going to be a dangerous century. It is going to be a turbulent century. There are enough men in all civilizations, not only in Islamic civilizations, who believe in violence, who believe in confrontation, who believe that the only solution is violence. And to check that, we need to be having an equally vigorous move towards dialogue and understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. We'll hear now from Michael Oren.
Or perhaps you won't, because I agreed essentially with everything Professor Ahmed said. It's terrible. Pleasure being here. Pleasure listening to you, Professor Ahmed. Cauldron of Turmoil. Sounds like my high school. Something that Vincent Peale should be stirring in a 1950s horror movie. Cauldron of Turmoil. Well, let's begin with turmoil, and then we'll move on to the opposite of turmoil, because I don't believe that the Middle East is condemned in the long run in an historical framework to turmoil. Let me begin with a tumultuous event, the event that I've written about in this book, the Six-Day War, the June War. That event, the book reminds its readers, all right, was the event, if you will, of every major milestone and occurrence in the subsequent 35 years of Arab-Israeli history. Leads directly to the War of Attrition, from the War of Attrition to the Yom Kippur War, to the Lebanon War, to the First Intifada, to the current Intifada, to the whole controversy surrounding the Israeli settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, the whole question of the status of the city of Jerusalem. All of these subsequent milestones emanated from 6 days of intense fighting back in June 1967. So you have an historical event, and I don't think there's an event in history, certainly not in modern history, anything like it, that was so limited in its time frame and so circumscribed geographically that has had such profound regional and even global ramifications. I'm fond of saying that the Six-Day War, for military leaders, for statesmen, both in the Middle East region and beyond, that war never really ended. We're still dealing with its outcome on a daily basis, both in the Middle East and even here in the United States. Now, what's extraordinary about this conclusion, about this mapping of history, is that this is a war, the 67 war, that virtually nobody in the Middle East wanted, that virtually nobody anticipated, and that most leaders Israelis and Arabs, I'm always shocking my Israeli listeners when I tell them that Nasser didn't want the Six-Day War. Everyone worked very hard to prevent this war from occurring. It's extraordinary that an event with so much impact on everyone's lives for decades, generations later, could have come about largely as a result of an accident. An accident, a series of events, an Israeli raid that triggers off a Jordanian reaction, and then an Egyptian reaction, and before you know it, the entire region tumbles down irrevocably, irreversibly, into war. An amazing occurrence. And it occurs because the Middle East in 1967 was deeply cast in what I call a context of conflict. And it was a context of conflict in which conflict was occurring at virtually every level, on the international level, in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, on a regional sphere, in the bitter and often violent rivalries between Arab rulers, not just between Israelis and Arabs, and then on the bilateral plane, the Arab-Israeli conflict, which by 1967 had become deeply intractable. When you have a context of conflict like that, which is volatile, unpredictable, it doesn't take very much. All you need is a little spark, and you can touch off a regional conflagration. Now, that type of conclusion is very salient in looking at the Middle East today, because the Middle East today remains deeply cast in a context of conflict, and a context of conflict that is every bit as explosive, if not more unstable, than that which existed in 1967. For example, the Cold War. The Cold War, as horrible as it was, had a sort of inborn bipolar stability. When President Johnson had a crisis in the Middle East, he got onto this machine called the hotline, and he sent a message to his counterpart, Alexei Kosygin, in the Kremlin. And they were able to limit, to some degree, the extent and the damage of that crisis. Today, if there's a crisis in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world, to whom is George Bush supposed to hotline? Osama bin Laden? There's nobody on the other side. Even the bitter rivalries, the feuds between Arab leaders in the 60s have been replaced today by internal unrest within the Arab countries. The fault lines within Arab countries today are not between Syria and Egypt per se, or Jordan and Saudi Arabia, but within each of these countries, in the often irreconcilable differences between governments, and usually non-democratic governments lacking political legitimacy, and their domestic rivals, which are almost invariably of an Islamic extremist temperament or vein, outlook. And even in the Arab-Israeli conflict, the lines are not so clearly drawn anymore. Keep in mind, Israel has a peace treaty, albeit a cold peace treaty, with Egypt, with Jordan. The Israelis are in dialogue with a range of Arabs, even Arabs who are ostensibly at war with the state of Israel. Lines are pretty much open. That's not the case as it was in 1967. There's a tremendous improvement there. And yet this context of conflict, as I mentioned earlier, is every bit as volatile. It's volatile because in this region today, were war to break out, it will not be a war like 1967. It will be a war that was very much a sterile, classical military engagement between conventional armies fought with men, planes, tanks, for the most part away from populated civilian areas, out in the desert somewhere. Were war to be fought today, it would not be fought by conventional forces, but by unconventional missiles, bombs, that will not be falling out in the desert somewhere. They'll be falling in the middle of our cities, in the middle of our neighborhoods, literally on our streets. Now, as someone who not only writes about this area of the world, but actually lives there, someone who has young kids who take a bus every morning to school, and someone who waits very nervously to hear that they got to school on those buses, they come home on those buses, as someone who right now has a son serving in an elite unit of the Israeli army, and I don't know where he is right now, this type of conclusion is not just academically riveting, it's personally quite terrifying. And so when I see a term like Cauldron of Turmoil, I actually don't have to go back to my high school. I just have to look around my neighborhood and look around my family and look around my life and see a tremendous amount of turmoil and a tremendous potential for far-reaching destruction and upheaval. Now, having said all that, how could I then be optimistic? Let me first start by saying, believe it or not, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic, first of all, because I am an historian, and I view regional issues through an historical prism. And I know that the great Irenic European Union of today, where the thought of war between two European states is so utterly remote. Only 60 years ago, Europeans were massacring one another by the millions. I have a novel part based on it. Massacring one another by the millions. Only less than 200 years ago, at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, did the Europeans finally sit down and decide that the normal state of relations between them should be one of peace and not one of war. So the whole notion of peace as the natural state of affairs in the West is a very recent vintage. The Middle East is embarking on a process that Europeans began 300 years ago, and it took them a long time to get from there to here. But history today, because of mass communications, because of technology, is telescoping, and things are happening far more rapidly. I say, give the Middle East time. Give the Middle East 25, 30, 40 years, and you will not recognize it today. Clearly, it is understood by people in this room, by people in rooms in my area of the world as well, that the current situation is untenable. That the combination of totalitarianism, of religious extremism, not just Islamic extremism, religious extremism, and the lack of education and economic opportunities can no longer continue. It has to be changed. That in the course of that change, there will be violence, there will be outbursts, there will be upheaval, but that it has to change. This area of the world is too precious, too haunted, too ripe with human and material potential to go to waste, because today the Middle East barely has any manufactured exports. It is really the most failed region of the world, and for no reason whatsoever. We are about to embark, I believe, on a peace process between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The United States is about to effect important changes in the region. For whatever feelings you may have about America's intervention in Iraq, it has created an irrevocable situation. I think it will create momentum, also, on one hand toward violence, but in the long term toward peaceful change and democratization. And again, as an historian, I know democracies rarely make war on one another. It's just not in people's interest. So while the Middle East remains on a certain level a cauldron of turmoil, I would also tend to view it, and I invite you to join me in viewing it, as a repository of future hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And we should thank whoever it is who comes up with the names for these panels, because they often provide these great points of departures so that people can do these, talented people can do these thoughtful riffs based on them. There's so much to tease out from both of your remarks. Let me start with you, Professor Ahmed. One of the things that struck me, and I know I constrained you from doing BBC-length analysis of what we need to understand about Islam, but be a little more specific with an American audience here. What do we need to understand about Islam to engage as citizens in these issues and debates?
Matthew, a good question, because it's a question that we all need to be trying to find an answer to. I think the first step needs to be aware how close an Islamic vision is to what the ideal American vision is of civilization. Now, this will come as a surprise, but let me substantiate this. The respect for learning, the respect for family, the respect to foreigners, immigrants. America is the great society of immigrants. The desire to learn about the universe, our surroundings. These are all deep, ancient Islamic values. What are the differences? And we need to know the differences. Traditional societies, like Islamic societies, still keep history alive. History is very much alive. We are hearing about the Shia in Iraq. What is all the fuss about? We are hearing about hundreds of thousands of Shia marching towards Karbala. Why are they marching to Karbala? What is in Karbala? Think of this in the American context. Think of something like 25 million Americans marching to some town. That is what is happening. They are marching there because the roots of Shia culture and thought start with Karbala. There was a famous battle the grandson of the Prophet, Hazrat Hussein, was killed, martyred, and he became the symbol of a fight against tyranny and injustice. Now, I believe that the more the discussion takes place, the more the informed discussion, it will help understanding, it will help ease the tensions, it will help bridge the gaps, and it will help Muslim society also. Because while we are talking of the West, there is a major crisis, as Michael's pointing out, within Muslim society. Muslim societies have a problem. Scholars are marginalized, scholars are chased out, scholars are often murdered. This kind of discussion cannot take place easily in most Muslim countries. I have to admit this. I have to put it on record. And the result is that a lot of this discussion just goes underground, and therefore the charlatans, the men of violence, can very easily sell and project a very different kind of Islam. And that is where you come in with someone like Osama bin Laden. And it's well to remember, Matthew, and I hate to say this again, but Mubarak predicted that in place of one Osama bin Laden, you may have 100 Osama bin Ladens in the wing. In my country, from Pakistan, 10,000 parents have named their sons Osama bin Laden. They haven't named their sons Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Sorry, Professor Walford, in spite of your efforts. Here we are, the greatest man of Pakistan history, a man of democracy, embodying democracy, Mr. Jinnah, and yet these parents have named their sons Osama. The question is, why? Why? Why?
And what's the, and Michael, I want to get you into this also, but what's the short answer to that? Is it a failure of elites? Is it a failure of economic development and education? I mean, how?
It's Matthew, a combination. It's a frustration. It's the failure of the elite. The elites in the Muslim world are often short-term. They want to just hang on to power. Very often they'll make deals. They are hated in most parts of the Muslim world by the average Muslim, the person living in the shanty town, who sees his or her life as miserable. They don't have water, they don't have electricity, they see the gap between the rich and the poor, they have poor education, and there's a great deal of frustration. There's awareness that there is wealth, there's oil wealth, for instance, and there's awareness that somehow their lives are not working out in the last 2 or 3 decades. And that anger finds expression in an Islamic channel. Because religion, I go back to my point, religion is very alive in our part of the world in traditional societies. And that channel of religion is then interpreted by certain people to mean violence. And that is where the danger lies.
Michael, you want to weigh in at all on
both on usually I have my phone on just to make me feel at home. Like, you know.
But on the conversation that I guess others need to understand about Islam, and also the conversation or reform that Islam has to engage with within itself.
I'm in an institute in Israel where there's a group of people who are working to identify a authentic Jewish political culture and tradition by culling it from the books of the Bible. And my reaction to that enterprise is, thank God we don't have a Jewish political tradition. There's one thing that we talked about, the similarities between Judaism and Islam and Christianity, and in many ways Judaism and Islam are usually much more similar than Christianity is. We both have an oral law, we both have a written law. They're actually called the same things and developed virtually at the same times. And Christianity is sort of the odd man out. But on one very essential way, Christianity and Judaism are similar and Islam is different. Judaism and Christianity were both developed during a period when neither Jews nor Christians in the normative period had power, had political power. We were minorities. Islam was developed at a time when Muslims ruled most of the civilized world. And so political power becomes ingrained in Islamic theology in a way that it isn't in Judaism and Christianity. And I think that Muslims today are still wrestling with that interaction of politics and theology. There is not one single Jewish book or one single Christian book that tells you what a good Jewish or Christian state is supposed to look like, but there are many hundreds, if not thousands, of Muslim books, of Islamic books that tell you what a good Islamic state should look like. And many people read these texts, even though they are 800, 900, 1,000 years old, they're reading them like they're texts today, telling them how to operate. And certainly some of the extreme elements very much are involved in that literature, Ibn Taymiyyah in particular. And so one of the crucial steps to rectifying that situation is really for a process of introspection and reformation, if I use that word in italics mine, reformation in Islam has to occur, and they have to re-examine very, very deeply their relationship with political power and find a way that will give them a model of living as, say, a peaceful minority in a non-Muslim majority population and living at peace with a world that may not be entirely Muslim in the long run. I think America does have a role to play with this, gingerly, with sensitivity. Tomorrow I'm going off to Washington, also called off by the country to talk about a program. Colin Powell has set up a $400 million program to promote constitutionalism and democracy in the Middle East, and my institute is serving as an advisor on that. We do a lot of work on constitutionalism. It's the beginning of a step. America has to offer its advice with sensitivity, not to try to impose it, not with force, but to let them know that we're here if they need help.
What's the, go ahead, Professor, because I'd love to...
I just want to make a comment on what Michael said and agreeing with the general thrust of his argument. I would like to emphasize that within Islam, the way it's set up Muslim society, Renaissance rather than Reformation, because Reformation has all sorts of theological connotations, right. And if Michael begins to suggest Reformation, I know what the response will be from
the counter-Reformation.
And I wouldn't want to be sitting next to him and the bombs start flying, so... So Renaissance is something I think all societies, even within Muslim society, there's a great need, a great urge, and I think it will be recognized.
What is, but let's tease this out even further, what can the shape of Islamic democracy come to be? How should we think about that from an American point of view, and maybe tease out when I come back to Michael on the how sensitively but constructively we can foster it? First.
Matthew, the question is about Islam and democracy, and I know that we've got all the activity in Washington now, people scurrying around looking for a democratic model for the Middle East and looking for a democratic model for Iraq in particular. And of course, there is no democratic model, and you have a problem. The problem is this, that when you go charging in, and as Michael says, you need sensitivity here, you need cultural sensitivity, because very soon the Iraqis are saying, we've got rid of this terrible tyrant, and we don't want another tyranny. And they're beginning to say this. Some of them are. So how do you deal with this? And at the same time, you are now directly linked with Islamic civilization over here in America. There's 7 million Muslims, and over there. The answer is to look for the model that already exists within Islam, which is a native, authentic, original model, and that is Jinnah. I go back to this name. 1930s, the greatest movement in the Muslim world was not the creation of Iran decades later, the Islamic Revolution of Iran. It was the creation of Pakistan in 1947, which was then the largest Muslim nation on earth, and it was led by Mr. Jinnah. And Jinnah, this is the significant point, when the people of South Asia were asked to vote, would they prefer a religious leader, a traditional religious leader, or Jinnah in his Savile Row suits, clean-shaven? They preferred Jinnah. It's a very significant point. So he comes in as not a religious leader, but a democratic leader. We have the model. I think Washington needs to be understanding and studying Jinnah in that particular model, so that the Muslim world knows it exists. You cannot make excuses that this is a foreign model, American model, and so on, and it needs to be implemented.
Michael?
I agree entirely. Every attempt to impose Western-style democracy with force on the Middle East has failed, and failed egregiously. Back in 1869, Ismail, the leader of Egypt, was told that he had to enact a constitution and create a parliament, and he got all of his notables together, and he said, okay, we need a right and a left. So he divided the room in half and said, okay, you're on the right and you're on the left. And it failed within a few years. It doesn't work. You have to find authentic roots. And whenever I hear that the Middle East has no tradition of democracy and therefore democracy takes root, I cannot disagree with that more emphatically. Not only are there recent secular examples of imperfect but interesting and vibrant democracies in Egypt, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq until 1958. That collapsed for various reasons, but for periods were working, vibrant, interesting democracy. So there are those models, and those models in the not-so-distant past. Certainly Eastern Europe, where democracy has taken hold, and today flourishing, had models from the very similar period. But deeper than that, within Islam itself, and I know you'll agree with me on this, there is a democratic tradition, a tradition of consensus, ijma, and that is a very powerful core concept in Islam that can provide a basis for building a democratic structure.
I just want to make one comment on what Michael has just said. He's raised a very important issue. Within Islam itself, there is absolutely nothing to prevent democracy. The prayer formation, if you ever go to a mosque and see how people pray, or the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, you will see pilgrims going round the black stone in a ritual formation. Everyone is dressed alike. It's a ritual dress, a white sheet, and you just don't know who's next to you. It could be the king of some country, it could be just an ordinary person, it could be an ordinary scholar, author, whatever. You get a complete breakdown of status because you are in the house of God and you're all equal in the house of God. So the sense of egalitarianism, perhaps not democracy, but egalitarianism is very, very strong, and that is something we can build on.
How does, building on that, it seems like, listening to both of you, that the challenge becomes for the policymakers and leaders is how to manage the risk or threat from what may be the extremist or dysfunctional or marginalized small percentage of these societies, perhaps on all sides, while moving forward along the lines that seem so potentially promising, and certainly nothing that's no bar in history or religion from trying to reach that promise, yet at the same time coping with the fact, Tom Friedman, the columnist of the New York Times, has this great phrase about the super-empowered angry men, because that small group today who is at the margin and discontent has the ability, because of technology and weaponry, to wreak so much more havoc. How do you, I was going to ask if you were a benevolent dictator, maybe that's a politically incorrect way to put it at this point, but if you were a benevolent dictator in these situations, what's the, or whispering in the ear of President Bush or the relevant leaders in the Mideast, what's the way to seize the promise and avoid the peril?
Matthew, this is the problem, that for many ordinary Muslims throughout the Muslim world, Washington's alliances and Washington's support of dictators is something that they see, and they blame for the misery of their lives. Now, there's all sort of series of connections they make, perhaps as distorted, perhaps not fully understood, but this is how they see the world, that our lives are made miserable because of Washington's support to our dictator. Now, going back to your notion of the benevolent dictator, we in Pakistan have had several benevolent dictators, but ultimately democracy is democracy and it has to come. The debate that is taking place in the Muslim world is not something that happened in the last 4 or 5 years. It did not even happen with the creation of Israel. It goes back to the 19th century with the first major impact of Western colonization on Muslim societies. And the debate, the response to the debate was a split between those who wanted modernity, a synthesis of the West and the East, and those who wanted to reject modernity and draw boundaries around Islamic society. In South Asia, you had Aligarh, the great symbol, the great university, which was a balance formed by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who wanted to balance Western modernity and Islamic tradition. And Deoband, in contrast, which wanted to draw boundaries around Islam. The middle of the 19th century, that debate is still being conducted in the Muslim world, and sometimes I am amazed because that is missed entirely by the scholars and they assume it's something new, it's a new phenomenon. The Taliban, Osama bin Laden, all these have genealogical links directly into the mid-19th century.
Michael, if you will be whispering into the Bush administration's ear shortly. I want to make clear I have not been contacted by the White House or the Pentagon to offer advice on...
You can go instead of me. I'd like to take this remark on a little different tack.
Sure.
And that is, what I find disturbing is that, about the situation in the Middle East today, is that far less so than the uneducated people in the street, it is, by contrast, the people who have had the most exposure to the West, who are most educated, who have the tendency to be most anti-Western. I just know on the Arab-Israeli plane, the people in the Arab world who are most vehemently anti-Israel against any type of peace accord with the Israelis under any circumstances tend to be from the educated intelligentsia class rather than the simple people on the street. And this raises some profound and disturbing questions about what this is. I think one of the great challenges facing the Arab world, and here I have to distinguish between the Arab world and the outer Muslim world. I know the outer Muslim world far less. is a need to wean this area of the world of an addiction to victimhood, a tendency to blame everything that has gone wrong on others, on the colonialist period, which in certain cases was very short in the Middle East, the Western colonial period, and to look deeply at the problems within the society and to take responsibility. Taking responsibility is a key and vital initial step toward the renaissance, if you will, of this area. Only when these people begin to take responsibility for much of what has gone wrong. That is not to say that the Europeans are blameless or the Israelis are blameless, all right? But to look at themselves and what has gone wrong. The United States Army, for whatever its foibles, did not loot the Baghdad Library and Museum. The Iraqi people did, all right? And it's a problem.
We'll get to Q&A and we'll get to... So, was that the end of that thought, or you're...
Now we get into controversy. It was just too touchy-feely.
I want us to, in a moment, I want to go to your questions, so people can begin to formulate them and, of course, take up posts near the two microphones that are here. But before we do that, let me ask one last question of the panel before we get to folks' questions on the role of the media in this. Michael, something you said struck me, the way that I guess contemporary forces of the media and related forces are telescoping history. I think a lot of folks watching the recent Iraqi war, there were so many mood swings that are sort of media generated by, oh my God, it's going to be over in 2 days. Oh my God, we didn't send enough people in. Oh my God, and all of this happened within a month. This is happening in various contexts. The media as a filter and the vehicle for these discussions and dialogues has an enormous power. Maybe just briefly, each of you can offer a thought on its role for pro and con and how to improve it.
The media.
Yes.
Well, I've dealt with the media extensively, being in government, having served in the Israeli government. The big problem I find is, particularly in the West, is the often desperate dearth of information about the Middle East, basic knowledge about Middle Eastern history, certainly about Middle Eastern languages and religions, that is exhibited by the overwhelming majority of reporters who come from the United States and travel through our areas. And so they are countering vastly complex situations that require a tremendous amount of knowledge, and they are woefully ill-equipped to deal with that. Some of them come for 3 days, and they're expected to somehow give you, the viewer, a sense of what's going on, and they're completely incapable. And often they look at the most superficial situation, and that's what you're getting, and that substitutes for substance. A responsible journalistic community will ensure that the people who are sent to the Middle East have at least a rudimentary knowledge of where they are. Every time I listen to CNN, I have to wince when they talk about what Iraq was before 1919, or what a Shiite is and what a Sunni is, and certainly what a Kurd is. They don't know in many cases, and that's a basic problem.
Professor?
I completely agree with Michael. He's been a bit gentle. I would say that it's been...
I never get accused of that.
I would say that what the media have done is really let down America, because the media are largely responsible for forming public opinion. And what has been happening is that instead of doing what I'm trying to do, which is trying to create understanding or point towards understanding, the media have consistently created a huge rift which has got bigger and bigger and bigger, because what we forget is that every time there's something on television here, I'm not naming names, but if you go to some of the well-known channels with numerology, which is near 1, 2, 3, you will see that the impact of this on the Muslim world is devastating. You try to talk of understanding and how Americans love democracy and how tolerant they are in the Muslim world, and they're going to quote you this media. They will say Americans hate Islam. Americans are on a warpath against Islam. I saw this discussion. I saw so-and-so abuse the Prophet. I saw so-and-so abuse the Quran. These are traditional societies with long memories. And the media really at this historic moment in time has let down both the United States and I believe its own role, its own great potential to instruct, to inform, and of course do what it has to do, ratings and entertainment and so on. But it has really let itself down. The images that come through the media, the stereotypes of Islam are now so embedded in everyone's mind terrorist, extremist, fanatic, fundamentalist, that the potential for dialogue becomes more difficult. How are you going to have dialogue when the other person is a terrorist, fundamentalist, extremist? There is no dialogue anymore. That is what is happening here. And as Michael points out, a lot of them you see strutting around the Middle East as though they're all Napoleons and Genghis Khans. And they're talking of societies which are ancient, which are riven with ethnicity and tribal and sectarian rivalries. They're talking of societies when they can't pronounce the name of the countries correctly. They're saying Iran. Iran is a state of locomotion. It's not the name of a country. It is Iran. It is not Iran. It is not Iraq.
Yeah.
And the people there are absolutely stunned. What are they talking about?
I want to get to your... go ahead, applaud. But we are in our... we've only got 5, 6, 7 minutes left, so if people have questions, I want to get to them. The tragedy on the media thing, though, is there was 24-hour coverage for all these channels. So much could have been done as a force for good. Yes, ma'am. Tell us who you are. And
I'm Nikki Keddy. I'm a specialist on the Middle East. I enjoyed this panel, and the question of prejudices against Islam is a very important one, but I felt that there was left out a discussion of the real political, economic role of the United States and of the government of Israel in bringing on some of these Arab reactions and then attitudes towards them. Certainly, the government of the United States has backed in many ways dictatorships all over the Muslim world, and Israel's especially current policies have been more than brutal. And
ma'am, yeah,
let
me, because
my
we've
question
got so much to go, can I invite them to react to the role of the U.S. and the thing briefly, if we can? And obviously, all these things could be teased out for hours, but just briefly, each of you, if you can.
I think I did mention that a lot of ordinary people do see many of the problems and trials and tribulations as linked directly or indirectly with the United States and their backing of military dictators.
Michael.
Thank you, Professor Keddy. I recall failing a test on your book back in graduate school, so that your question is no less traumatic. She says Iran. It is, I want to reiterate what I said earlier, and that is that the colonialists, the Americans, the Israelis are not blameless, all right? The blame could be spread around. On the other hand, I can also note that the United States has intervened extensively, poignantly in recent years to save Muslims, all right? Whether in Afghanistan, in the Balkan areas, has done tremendous through its aid programs. In my book of the 1960s, 3/4 of the Egyptian people were eating American wheat that they got for free every day. All right? So the American record in the Middle East is not Manichaean. It's not white and black here, and that's not to say that it's blameless. All right? The problem is in the Middle East, everyone is viewing it as entirely full of blame and not taking any responsibility on themselves. And it's true of the Israeli situation as well. I can go into detail about how the Palestinians, as Ab Ibn used to say, have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. They were given an opportunity 2 years ago to get the state, which is exactly what they're going to get now if they stop terror, and all of this death and destruction has been completely unnecessary. And they have to take responsibility for that.
To this side, sir, brief question. Tell us who you are.
My name's Owen. I'm a student here. I have a question about Iran. Basically, it seems like this is a country that has a democratic structure in place with a dictatorial oversight. It has people who started the revolution speaking out against it, sort of like Agajarian being put in jail, threatened to be killed. Massive protests for democracy and against the government. What is it going to take for these countries to institute the government that it seems that they want?
Great question.
Owen, first of all, I'm grateful that you got Iran right and that you that you're not being influenced by the media. These countries, Iran, Pakistan, all these countries, Egypt, remember in terms of history, in a historical context, this is just a flick of a finger. It's a batting of the eyelid in terms of time. 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, they've just had democracy or attempts at democracy. It may take another generation or two when you see some form of real democracy emerging in these societies. The important point is to see what is happening and not to do those things that delays democracy. not to be doing those things that in fact it encourages the forces of anarchy and chaos within these societies. That is important, because very often when matters are mishandled internationally, you then encourage the forces that allow the regrouping of those elements in society which don't want change, which would continue the state of anarchy in these Muslim societies.
I want to take, unfortunately we have time for just one last question because I've been given the signal. It is possible that the authors may linger for moments here afterward to be assaulted and confronted by these questions. There's also going to be a book signing afterward for this panel located in the North signing area in line D. Sir, brief question?
Yes, my name's Joe. Questions about Iraq. The borders of Iraq were drawn largely by Great Britain after the fall of the Ottoman Empire to facilitate Great Britain getting oil. The question is, why would it be an illegitimate thing for those borders to be redrawn now on more traditional tribal and sociological lines? And why is it more legitimate to keep the borders where they currently are?
Michael, you want to?
Funny you should mention that. About 2 weeks ago, I was summoned to the American Embassy in Tel Aviv, this time to meet with a high-ranking, unnamed official from the Department of Defense. And I proposed to him exactly this. Now, as an Israeli, it's very difficult to come out in public and talk about dividing up another Arab state. That immediately disqualifies the idea. But I did propose to him. I said, listen, just basically what you said. I said, Iraq, since its creation, has really been held together only by a strong central force. It was created as an entity to further British imperial interest, particularly around the area of Mosul, to get that oil and have access to the Gulf. Is America, I asked him this question in all innocence, is America willing to continue to exert that strong central force? Because you're going to have to push the Kurds out of Mosul. Now, after they've aided you, you're going to have to deal with the Shiites in the south. Could you think in terms of just sort of letting Iraq revert to historical form and create 3 independent republics there, Kurdistan in the north that would serve as a check against Turkey's drift toward Islamic extremism? It would remind the Turks that they should remember who their allies are. Keep a Sunni republic in the center as a check both on Syria and Saudi Arabia, and a Shiite state that would serve as an alternative model for a Shiite democracy to Iran. And he looked at me, this high unnamed official, and said, oh, that's interesting. And last Sunday's Washington Post had an op-ed piece by a general, I don't know if you saw it, you're in Washington, that said that argument almost word by word. And I wonder if it's a plant that somehow they give this out to one of their generals and they float it out there. But it's certainly worth thought. It raises a number of controversial issues, where the United States has now invaded a sovereign Arab state and is going to now effect far-reaching changes in it. But I think it merits serious debate.
You know, can I make a comment?
Yes.
Yeah. I won't start clapping till you hear my answer also. Joe, a very important point you raised. I was the administrator in charge along the tribal areas between Pakistan and Afghanistan. That international border is called the Durand Line. Durand was the British officer who, in the late 19th century, divided the areas between what was then Afghanistan and British India. And I asked the tribal chiefs, I said, how did Durand come up with this line? Because I was in a valley and it made no sense. It was a flat valley and there was an international border running through it. There was no geographical feature, no river there. And the tribal elders, who have great memories, said, Sahib, which means sir, what happened was that Durand was here late at night in this tent in the middle of the valley, and he was all alone, one Englishman all by himself, getting very drunk. And he came reeling out of this tent at about 3 a.m. and he said, look, I'm going to turn 3 times round and throw this bottle in the direction of Afghanistan. And where it lands, Stanley Walt was holding his head because he knows how these international borders were formed. And he said, where the bottle lands, there shall be the British Empire. So he actually did that. He threw the bottle. So a lot of the empires, after they disintegrated, created nations with exactly this kind of illogic. But having said that, Joe, having said that, the last 2 or 3 generations have lived within certain boundaries. sometimes uncomfortably, sometimes held together like in Iraq by a brutal dictator, very different kinds of groups, and that has created an identity. Now, an idea, however logical it may seem or tidy, that you start chopping up Arab countries is going to be greeted with absolute uproar, and it will be absolutely unacceptable in the Arab and the Muslim world, and I may add, the rest of the world. This will really be resisted very strongly, simply because of the logic of the last few decades.
Let me make a quick suggestion for folks, because I need to give a wrap-up, because C-SPAN needs to have a kind of clean end. So in about a nanosecond, I'm going to ask you to thank our panel with a round of applause, but I think our authors would be willing to stay for another 5 minutes or so after we're off the air of that substantive TV network to answer a few more questions before they run for a signing. So please join me in thanking our panel with a show of... And now we may continue with a couple of minutes of post-C-SPAN 5 minutes Q&A. If that's acceptable to the panel, we can have a couple more minutes of questions.
Yeah, a question for Professor Ahmed.
Tell us who you are, please.
Oh, K. Meridian. Yes, thank you. Professor, if you could answer for me a question. In the Quran, I have been told that the words "kill the infidel" are those words actually in the Quran? And if they are, could you clear that up for us?
I'm very glad you asked that, because in fact I opened my book Islam Under Siege with these questions, precisely these. The exact discussion is that you must fight and resist all aggressors against Islam itself, whether they be Jews or Christians or Muslims, because you're talking about aggression against any attack. Islam very consciously does not adopt the Christian position, which is if you are slapped on one cheek, you turn the other cheek. Islam says if you are attacked, your family is attacked, your wife is attacked, your children are attacked, it is your duty to resist. Now, what has happened is very interesting, your question, because I raised two questions. One is the one on wives. A Muslim says, I'm allowed 4 wives. This is what a Muslim male will say. And he'll quote the Quran, like this particular verse. What the Muslim will not quote is the second line of that verse, which says, in times of war, in times of crisis, you can take 1 wife, 2 wives, 3. It's better to take wives than to have them as women as prostitutes or let them be destitute. But you cannot, in reality, look after 4 wives as equal. Therefore, God is pleased if you just take 1 wife. This is the rest of the quote. So exactly in this way, when you take this particular verse out, the first line, then it seems that a Muslim is being instructed to go and blow up Jews and Christians or even Muslims. What people, the critics of Islam, do is to take this verse out of context. And what Osama bin Laden does is also take this verse out of context, because he's just quoting that one line. Read the second line, which says, but God prefers peace with the Jews and the Christians, because they're also people of the book.
Tell us who you are, please.
My name is Charles. This question is directed more towards Michael than Akbar, although I'd be interested in having his input on it also. Towards you, Michael, because you'll be having perhaps some direct political input to the process about to be undertaken. Clear back in 1959, Frantz Fanon outlined the process of colonialism, saying, in effect, that in order to conquer a people, you must first convince them that you're superior, and that means you must basically denigrate their traditions and their traditional beliefs. And it seems to me that, at least for our own domestic consumption, we seem to undertake that very well in the way we talk about people of the Middle East. Now, my question to you is, with the history of the United States, having in the last 100 years inherited from Britain a lot of their colonial territories and from Spain and so on, and the history of the Middle East and so many other regions where we have set up governments supposedly democratic.
I appreciate these are complicated things and long, but
what will you do
we have a timing limit.
when that is our history, And the people that we're dealing with know that is our history, even if the people of our own country do not. What can you do to influence that process to make sure that a democratic society that arises in these areas after our occupation is a truly democratic one, meaning that they have control of their own resources?
I'm afraid that's going to have to be the last question because they must go afterward. I'm sorry, but we'll have to let the.
Then I'm going to answer. I'm going to respond with a very radical, controversial answer. I think that the problem exists of denigration not on the side of the people you probably think denigrate. It exists on the side of the apologists rather than on the side of the denigrators. Let me say this. In Israel, it's very common for critics of the government to say it's because what the government is doing that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are doing X, Y, and Z. And there's a strong tendency within Israeli political discourse to perceive the Arab side in our conflict as purely reactive and not having a political dynamic that is entirely their own and not just a reaction to what we do to them. Right? By the same token, in the Arab world in general, and in critics of American policy in the Middle East, is a tendency to see that what goes on in Iraq or what's going in the Arab world in general is a reaction to what America is doing. It's a reaction to globalization. It's a reaction to colonialism. And on a certain level, that reaction is, that type of mentality is racist. It's racist because it's denying the other side an authentic ability to decide for itself and to have its own dynamics. Right? And so Frantz Fanon, with all due respect to him, is missing the other, is taking the debate to the other extreme. It's taking all of the weight as what we do to them and not what goes on in their own societies themselves. When I talk about responsibility and taking responsibility, it is precisely getting away from that tendency to blame us for what everything goes on wrong on their side. Sometimes things that go wrong on their side are their fault.
I think in all this and the confrontation that is taking place, we need to really work at discovering the points of contact. I had lunch with the American ambassador in 1999 in Islamabad, and he was perplexed. He said, there's a military coup just taking place. How do we as Americans relate to Pakistani leadership? And I talked about Jinnah, and I said, do you know, Mr. Ambassador, that Jinnah was a great admirer of Abraham Lincoln? And he perked up and he said, can I quote that? I said, do that. And next day, the headlines in the Pakistani press were American ambassador gives major speech and he says, your great founder, the great man Jinnah, was in fact a great admirer of Abraham Lincoln, and this is what brings our people together. This is where scholarship, this is where thinkers have to be really moving towards in the 21st century. Societies are too jumbled up, juxtaposed, living together, interpenetrated, for us to be talking of divides and confrontation.
We're going to have to leave it there. Please thank our panel, Michael Oren and Akbar Ahmed, and thank you for joining us. Sure.
From inside Haynes Hall, one of the places on campus where lots of the events are happening at the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, you've been watching this panel discussion about the